Okay, so let's just jump right in. First of all, welcome to our Insider Speaker Series on sea level rise. I am Emily Doyle, and I'm the Climate Resilience Program Manager here at California State Parks Foundation. I'm really excited to have you all here with us today. So if you want to go ahead and you can introduce yourself in the chat, maybe your name, where you're from. It's always interesting to see how widespread the interest is in these issues. And are really, we put them on for members to learn more about issues that are facing state parks and how California State Parks Foundation is taking action. We're a member-supported nonprofit dedicated to protecting and preserving California state parks. And one way we do that is informing our members, informing the public about these issues and what we're doing to address them and perhaps inspire them to take action themselves. So today, we're going to be hearing from several experts on sea level rise and sea level rise adaptation. As we know, sea level rise is a major threat to our coastal parks, which actually comprise 1/3 of the California coastline. So this is a very important topic. And excited to get into it. But before that, I'll just go over some logistics. So everyone will be muted throughout the webinar, but we will be using a Q&A function. You should see a button on the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead, click that, enter them there, and we will get to as many as we can. And lastly, we simply ask that people be respectful of our speakers and each other as we go through the webinar, just to make sure we all enjoy the event as much as possible and learn all we can. So here is an overview of what you'll hear about for the next hour. I'm going to begin just by giving some background on sea level rise adaptation in California. We're going to follow that up with two panelists who are going to have prepared presentations about their work in sea level rise adaptation. And then we're going to move into some questions and have an open Q&A with the audience. And first, before we jump all into that, let me introduce our speakers a bit more. So our first speaker is going to be Rae Taylor-Burns. And Rae is a Ph.D. candidate from UC Santa Cruz's Coastal Resilience Lab. She has a bachelor's in engineering from Yale, a master's in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara. And her current research explores how coastal and marsh ecosystems can protect communities from flooding, which is increasing with rising sea levels. And then following Rae's talk, we're going to speak with or hear from Michelle Succow. And Michelle is a senior environmental scientist at California State Parks, and she's focused on sea level rise and coastal hazards. Michelle has a bachelor's in biology from Cal Poly Humboldt with an emphasis on sandy beach ecology. And she started at California State Parks in 2018, where she led the development and now implementation of the department's sea level rise adaptation strategy. So really looking forward to hearing more about their work shortly. But before getting to those talks, I'm first just going to lay out some background information on sea level rise adaptation, to really help put everything into context as we move forward. So a little bit about my background. I am a California native. I'm originally from Capitola in the Bay Area. I have a PhD in earth science from the University of Cambridge, where I focused on polar and global climate. Specifically, I analyzed Antarctic ice cores for climate reconstructions to learn more about past and potential future climate events. And I was really excited to now take my research background and bring that back to California and apply it to the parks that I've visited pretty much every summer since I was young. So I was really excited to join California State Parks Foundation last year. And now let's learn a bit more about sea level rise and sea level rise adaptation. So throughout this talk, we're also probably going to be putting some informational links in the chat. So if you want to keep your eyes on that, you can explore more information there. Okay, so as you're aware, since you're here, sea level rise for climate change poses an increasing threat. And this is particularly clear in California. We're seeing increased storm surges, flooding, coastal erosion, multiple impacts that are damaging infrastructure and threatening coastal communities. So on the left here, you can see damage to Sea Cliff State Beach from the recent severe storms. And on the right, there's a road at China Camp State Park, which is regularly flooding. And this issue is exacerbated by rising sea levels. And as we're experiencing these impacts more and more, we really need to think about, what will the future look like? Because we need to know what's coming in order to prepare for it. And to learn more about that and, plan ahead, we actually need to look back a little bit and understand some background to see how sea level rise, what's happening, how it's behaved in the past, and how it's going to behave in the future. So here is a map from NASA, and this shows satellite data showing the increase in sea level rise, or excuse me, the increase in sea level for the past 30-ish years. And you can see since 1993, which is when satellite data became available, sea level has risen almost 10 centimeters, or around 10 centimeters, and is now increasing by 3.4 millimeters a year. However, this rate is actually accelerating. And if that trend continues, we could expect to see 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of the century. So it's kind of an abstract idea, picturing, what things will look like in almost 100 years or 70 years. So we really need to think about, what does that look like? How will that affect us? And one thing that really helps us visualize this is using, NOAA has a sea level rise viewer online. This is interesting to play around with. You can go check it out yourself. And it lets you look at different sea level rise scenarios in different regions. So here on the left is a current map of the Bay Area. And you can see in the green areas shows particularly low-lying areas around the Bay Area. And on the right, you can see what happens if sea levels rise by 0.9 meters. And as we know, this is a possibility. So the light blue is showing where the land has been inundated. You can actually see that most low-lying areas have been completely lost. And this potential scenario, again, really makes it clear that we have to take action now. And that has led to numerous adaptation methods that people have been using to try to prepare for this future. So let's go over some of those. Historically in California, we've used a lot of hard armoring methods, and these are immovable constructions like seawalls in the upper left, or riprap, which you can see in the upper right corner, which is basically stacking large rocks and boulders. The problem with hard armor is that its sole purpose is to protect what's behind it, and that's usually at the expense of the shoreline and the surrounding ecosystems. So you can see in the bottom picture here is a picture of riprap in Monterey Bay, which is protecting that structure up on the cliff. But you can see in front of the riprap, the beach has been completely lost. Whereas on either side, where there is no hard armor, it has been allowed to naturally progress inland. So this is a perfect example, this image, of the damage that these can cause. And also, structures like this are only temporarily effective, because eventually as sea levels continue to rise, they're going to overtop those structures, and another solution or adaptation measure will be necessary. So because of that, people are increasingly turning to other methods, such as nature-based solutions. Example of that you can see in these images is a living shoreline. And these, they leverage coastal protection offered by natural ecosystems, such as vegetated sand dunes and coastal marshes and wetlands. So on the top, you can see before and after pictures of the shoreline at Cardiff State Beach in Southern California. On the left, you see riprap, which has been replaced, which you see on the right, by vegetated dunes. In the bottom image, you see Yosemite Slough and Candlestick Point State Recreation Area. And this is a wetland restoration project that California State Parks Foundation has actually worked on. And I'm going to be talking about that a bit more later on, so you can learn more about our work there. And these living shorelines really act as buffers against rising sea levels and have been shown to be effective adaptation measures. And as sea levels continue to rise, we're going to need to keep exploring different adaptation measures to figure out what's the most effective, how we should move forward, and what path we should take. And on that note, now that we know a little bit more about background, adaptation, general information like that, let's move to Rae's presentation, where she's going to talk about her work valuing the flood reduction benefits of marshes in the San Francisco Bay. So take it away.
Hey everyone, my name is Rae Taylor-Burns. I am finishing up my PhD at UC Santa Cruz with the Coastal Resilience Lab, and today I'll be sharing about valuing the flood reduction benefits of marshes in the San Francisco Bay. This is a project that we have worked on with our lab at the university, as well as collaborators at the Nature Conservancy, the US Geological Survey, and a little bit from the San Francisco Estuary Institute as well. So in this work, we're focused in San Mateo County, which is shown here on the left. And when I started this project, when I thought about flooding, my mind went to places like New Orleans or Miami or maybe even New York City. But it turns out that San Mateo County is one of only 6 counties in the entire country with over 100,000 people at risk of flooding with 3 feet of sea level rise, which could happen by the end of the century. So it also has the highest future flood risk in the state. And since it's a great place to look at how we can reduce flood risk from climate change. Next slide. It turns out that San Francisco Bay is also an area with a lot of like political interest in nature-based solutions. So for example, in 2016, voters in the 9 Bay Area counties passed Measure AA, which established a $12 per year parcel tax to support San Francisco Bay wetland restoration in preparation for climate change. The South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project is underway as the largest wetland restoration project on the West Coast. And organizations like SFEI have done a lot of work investigating how this can be done in the region. For example, they published this really amazing document, the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, several years ago. Next slide, please, which outlines all types of different nature-based adaptation options for adapting to flooding from sea level rise and climate change. So for example, this image here shows the options in the Foster City, Redwood City area, which could include marsh restoration, it could include levee breaching, it could include beach restoration. So this document is really amazing, and it has served as a kind of guidepost as we've been working on this project. Next slide. So when we think about marsh restoration in San Francisco Bay, it's good to think about the challenges that marshes in the region are facing. One challenge facing Bay Area marshes is that over the past several decades and predicted into the future, marshes are subsiding relative to mean sea level. And this is because over history, marshes have been able to kind of keep up with changes in sea level. And this happens when they get overwashed with waves, sediment in the water can sort of settle out and land on the marsh platform. And over time, this allows marshes to kind of keep pace with changing sea levels. But if sea levels begin to change too quickly, marshes lose this ability to keep up with changes. And so they begin to drown relative to mean sea level. Another challenge is that throughout the region, marshes have been historically used for farming hay, for making salt, for subdevelopments, and all of these uses require that they get separated from the bay and they don't get inundated with water. And so in order to allow that to happen, there have been many levees built surrounding marshes that disconnect them from the tide. And finally, as you could imagine, marshes that are drowning or marshes that are no longer connected to the tide can no longer support the typical marsh vegetation, which requires specific inundation periods. So we have these 3 things happening: marshes subsiding, marshes separated from the tide by levees, and loss of vegetation. And this image here shows a couple examples of that. The area out in front is kind of a healthy marsh. And we see in the back on the right, there's a marsh area that's lower, and you can see that it's more covered with water. So that's an example of a marsh that is subsided relative to mean sea level. And then out here in the front, or I guess mid-ground in the left, is actually historical marsh that has been used for salt farming. So that's that big white square area actually used to be a marsh and now no longer supports marsh vegetation and is separated from the tide by levees. And those ponds are, that's the Redwood City Peninsula there. So right by the port of Redwood City, the Cargill salt ponds, owned and operated by the Cargill Corporation. Next slide, please. So in this project, we used a hydrodynamic model to simulate what would happen if we restored marshes in the bay and to see how that would influence flood risk. The first thing we did in the model is to raise the elevation of these different sites in San Mateo County that were identified by local planners as like potential restoration sites. So this image here is showing how much each of these identified sites would need to be raised in order to support a healthy range of marsh vegetation. Next slide. We also strategically breached levees in the model to simulate how, for example, salt ponds could be restored to marshes. And this would require breaching the levees across a historical channel, as you can see here. The blue areas show where breaches were done in the model, and we can see through this aerial imagery that they are across historical tidal channels, which is how our wonderful group of stakeholders explained to us that they would do this restoration in practice. Next slide, please. In our model, we also included changing vegetation. So a marsh that has subsided, or for example, the ponds, which have subsided and are separated from the tide, we could raise their elevation, breach the levees, and then include vegetation in those areas by increased friction in the model. And so these three things together can kind of simulate how a restored marsh would function. And we can look at the resulting flood extents to see how restoring marshes might influence flood risk in the bay. Next slide, please. So results from this analysis have showed that restoring marshes in San Mateo County can provide real flood reduction benefits. This image here shows the flood reduction benefits of restoration at 3 different sea levels. So 0 meter sea level, 0.5 meter sea level, and 1 meter sea level. The 2 columns show benefits measured with 2 different discount rates, 3% and 7%. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, recommends using 7%. They actually require that you use 7% in order to perform any benefit cost analysis. But municipalities, conservation organizations can use lower rates like 3%. So this is just to show how the discount rate affects the benefits. But we see that the benefits are very high, reaching almost $1 billion with a meter of sea level rise. And we do see that they increase into the future as sea levels rise. So next slide, please. So an outcome of this work is that we were able to quantify the flood reduction benefits of certain specific marsh restorations. So for example, this map is showing the impacts of marsh restoration south of the San Francisco airport. The top row is showing how flood depth changes with the restoration. So areas that are bright blue have flood depth decreased due to the marsh restoration out in front. The bottom row is showing the benefits of marsh restoration. And this was done by summing damage to buildings and infrastructure throughout this region. And we see when we sum all this up that this very narrow fringing marsh restoration south of SFO can result in $350,000 per acre of benefits with 0 meters of sea level rise and $3.75 million of benefits per acre with 0.5 meter of sea level rise. And these dollar values are useful because managers and local decision makers can look at this value and weigh it against the cost of doing the restoration. So if we know that we're going to get $350,000 per acre of benefits, then we can weigh that against how much does it cost to restore a marsh in this area and make an informed decision based on the benefits and costs of proceeding. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in learning more about this work, we recently put out a policy brief with the Nature Conservancy valuing the flood reduction benefits of marsh restoration in the San Francisco Bay. Here's my contact information. I would be happy to answer any additional questions or provide anyone with the link to this paper where you can read a little bit more in depth about how we did this and what next steps could be for flood managers and planners in the San Francisco Bay. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rae. That was really interesting. I look forward to exploring it more later on when we get to some questions. And now let's move over to Michelle so we can hear more about what's going on in California state parks.
Thank you, Emily. So as Emily said, my name is Michelle Succow. I'm a senior environmental scientist at California State Parks. Following getting my graduate degree, I started working at state parks, and I've been there for 5 years now, focusing on sea level rise, coastal hazards, and adaptation. When I first started at state parks, my job was to form and collaborate with a multidisciplinary team to develop a statewide sea level rise adaptation strategy for the department. And that strategy was finalized and released in 2021. Since its release, my job has switched to implementing that sea level rise adaptation strategy. And so with the few minutes I have today, I wanted to very quickly cover what is State Park Sea Level Rise Adaptation Strategy and what is in it. Then talking about how we've been focusing our efforts on implementing that strategy. And then lastly, very briefly talking about a project that we've been piloting in our San Diego Coast District. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk about the Sea Level Rise Strategy and what it is. At the highest level, State Parks Sea Level Rise Adaptation Strategy is a framework. It's a framework for promoting effective decision-making for sea level rise adaptation. And it does so by recommending updates to existing operational processes to better incorporate sea level rise considerations. And it also recommends the development of 13 decision support tools. And I want to talk about each of those a little bit further. So first, the strategy calls for updates to our existing operational processes through the implementation of a suite of actions. I want to give a couple of examples of these efforts. So it includes things such as updating our internal policies and guidance documents to better consider sea level rise. Another example is to complete sea level rise vulnerability assessments at our coastal park units, to collaborate with our partners and other statewide agencies to help with other statewide sea level rise efforts, updating or creating new interpretive or engagement materials focused on sea level rise, and other kinds of similar efforts. On the other hand, the strategy also recommends development of those 13 decision support tools, which are really oriented towards our district staff, the staff that are out in the field, working in our coastal park units, developing adaptation projects and plans. And the idea is that these tools will be able to help them incorporate sea level rise more effectively into their projects. A couple of examples of these tools, I mentioned there's 13 of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple of examples. One is a tool to help our district staff compare different adaptation options to help them figure out of the full suite of options out there, what might be best suited for their park unit and for that particular project location. Another tool example is a tool to help develop what's known as trigger points, or also known as decision points, to help inform their adaptive management. And really that tool is oriented to helping a decision maker or a park manager think through when is it time to move from one adaptation solution onto the next one to continue to improve coastal resilience in that area. So at the highest level, just a quick summary again, the Sea Level Rise Strategy, it's a framework. It recommends some actions and some tools to be developed at the highest level. All right, so now let's talk about implementation. Next slide, please. So since the strategy was released, we've focused our implementation in 3 main focus areas. First is capacity, and should say training. We've been developing internal trainings and improving our internal capacity just to be more effective in our sea level rise work. Second, to implement those actions and to develop those support tools that are listed in our sea level rise strategy. And those are at various stages of implementation and development. And the third focus area is implementing actual adaptation projects on the ground in our coastal park units. And that has taken a full suite of forms, whether it's beach nourishment projects, living shorelines, like the example Emily listed at the beginning, et cetera. But importantly, it has also included testing new innovative approaches, nature-based approaches as well to coastal adaptation. So lastly, I don't have too much time left, so quickly want to cover one of those projects that we have underway in our San Diego Coast District, where we are using that process to develop one of those 13 tools identified in our strategy. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this project has several deliverables, several objectives, but again, at the highest level, what this project is aiming to do is to test an approach to understand sea level rise vulnerability and prioritize adaptation across multiple management scales. And let me explain that a little further. So for this project, we are completing sea level rise vulnerability assessments and developing adaptation pathways for each of the coastal park units in our San Diego Coast District. So those are the park units in the figure in the right-hand side. You can see the park units listed on that map there. And so that is one scale of this project, vulnerability at the park unit level. Following those assessments, we are going to be summarizing all of those results at a regional scale for the entire district to help our San Diego Coast District better understand vulnerability at a regional scale to be able to prioritize their adaptation efforts. The ultimate goal of the project is to develop a toolkit so that we can take the lessons learned in the process that we've developed along the way to be able to apply these efforts to the remaining coastal districts of the state park system. Just quickly want to say where we're at. So we are next going to be looking at some draft adaptation pathways for these different park units and then summarizing into that regional report. And then as a final step in the process, aside from the toolkit development, is to conduct some feasibility studies so that we can hopefully implement some adaptation projects, the priority projects that we've been able to identify through this process. And that's all I think I have time for. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I'm scribbling questions down as you're talking. So, okay, so now we know some more about background, sea level rise adaptation, what's going on in state parks. And I'm gonna give some, as I mentioned in the beginning, a little more information about a project that California State Parks Foundation is working on. And that is our wetland restoration project at Yosemite Slough in Candlestick Point State Recreation Area in San Francisco. And this is a 20-year wetland restoration project that we've undertaken. And not only has this resulted in creating a living shoreline, which we've discussed previously, but it was also an excellent opportunity to really bring environmental justice to the surrounding community, which has a disproportionate number of disadvantaged households. And we could help clean up the site, create coastal access, and help try to bring some environmental justice to that region. So if we look a little more at where it's located, Yosemite Slough is in Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. As I said, this area has a disproportionate number of disadvantaged communities. And over 150 years of development have led to almost a complete loss of the tidal marsh system, and also significant industrial pollution has been dumped in this area. So you can see in the upper right image is an aerial view of the slough before restoration work. You see there's no marsh habitat. The straight edges of the slough show a lot of industrial fill, area being supported by riprap, and basically very altered region without any natural habitat. And then the bottom right as well, you can see what the shoreline looked like. That picture is from 2011, I think. So this is what it looked like. So now let's take a look at how it is now after California State Parks Foundation has been since it began this project. So here you see, we have completed 7 acres of wetland restoration on the north side of the slough. You can see there's 2 bays that we created. And this work, it not only restored tidal influence to the area involving removing riprap, removing fill, stuff like that, but also created a lot of new habitat. You can see in the bottom bay, there's that white kind of dot in the middle, and that's actually a bird island that was made to serve as habitat for a lot of the coastal birds. And the impact of this work is also clear when you look at some on the ground pictures. So here, these are images post-restoration. On the left, you see it at low tide. On the right, you see it at high tide. And you can see at high tide how the water, instead of being constrained in this narrow channel, is now allowed to move inland and inundate the restored wetland. And again, as we've mentioned, this is can serve as a buffer to sea level rise, also can reduce erosion in the area. And we're still continuing this work today. We hold regular cleanup events, volunteer events. You can see in the right-hand image, we have a volunteer who's doing a trash cleanup. And we're also continuing with habitat restoration and currently developing a long-term monitoring and maintenance program just to ensure the continued success of this project. So yeah, that is one of our major projects that we work on, and we're very proud of the results. So now, so that people learned more about all that, what's going on in state parks, work we've been doing, sea level rise in general. Let's dig a little more into the speaker's work. And so I have a couple questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. So Rae, I'll just go to you first. And I was hoping you could talk some more about the challenges that are involved in designing and implementing these solutions, such as accommodating or adapting coastal infrastructure in order to allow installing these wetlands, or et cetera.
So yeah, as you guys all probably know, anyone who lives in the Bay Area may know, there's already a lot of levees and seawalls that are protecting communities from storms and flooding. And so yeah, this marsh restoration project that I talked about highlights like one pathway to adapt to climate change, but there also will probably be a need to adapt existing infrastructure. One way that can be done is through it's called horizontal levees. So basically, if you have a levee that's protecting a community, you can restore a narrow fringing marsh on the seaward side of it that presents like a little kind of strip of habitat and can reduce wave action that may hit the levee. And so it can reduce flooding, and it may also protect the levee system. So this is one of the adaptation pathways that was identified in the SFEI Adaptation Atlas that I mentioned to you all. And yeah, basically it's a really complex problem, and it's not like there's one specific answer that's good for everywhere. It will depend place by place. Like I said, the SFEI Adaptation Atlas presents just an amazing amount of information on this. So I can send the link to that document for anyone who's interested in learning more.
Oh, turning off mute, okay. Great, thanks. And now Michelle, if you could talk a bit more about how does California State Parks Sea Level Rise strategy align with other states' efforts? A bit more about the policy context in which California State Parks Sea Level Rise work is taking place.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So during the development of our department's sea level rise adaptation strategy, it was important to ensure that our process and the resulting product was going to be aligned with other statewide efforts, whether it was other state guidance or policy that was coming out. So for example, when we were developing the strategy, we wanted it to be aligned with some of the key documents, such as the State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance that was produced by the Ocean Protection Council, California Natural Resources Agency, as well as with, for example, the California Coastal Commission's Sea Level Rise Policy Guidance. So, the regulator on the coast. So I want to make sure we're aligned with them too, of course. We also, while we were developing the strategy, participating in collaborative statewide efforts with other agencies and partners. Some of you might be familiar with the State of California Sea Level Rise Principles for Aligned State Action. It's a set of principles really meant to help all of the various agencies, California agencies, that work on sea level rise to take an aligned approach to how we're acting on sea level rise. And so State Parks was also a part of that process. And we continue to be in those kinds or participate in those kinds of efforts, and any evolving science and policy and guidance that comes out, we continue to incorporate that into our work.
Okay, great, thank you. So now we can go ahead and open it up to the audience Q&A. Again, we have that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And let me see, we have a few that we've been collecting. Someone's asking, where can I see what work, if any, is underway in the San Diego Bay area? I'm not sure if Michelle, you know any specific places that would be good to check out?
Yeah, there's a couple of efforts. So for state, I'm trying to think of the name of the group. There's the San Diego Climate Collaborative. They are leading a project down there to look at the regional sea level rise adaptation efforts. And so I would recommend going to their website to see if they have any efforts happening in the San Diego Bay area. I also know that the Port of San Diego, as well as the naval base down there, and I'm unfortunately blanking on the name of the naval base at the moment, but they also are doing some collaborative efforts in the Bay Area, and would recommend taking a look at their websites as well.
Great. Let's see. Here's another one. Is there a San Francisco Bay-wide plan to adapt and protect shorelines sea level rise? The bay is like a large bathtub. If San Mateo adapts, won't more water go elsewhere? So how do you align local efforts?
For that one, that's a good question. The Bay is working collaboratively, like across the whole region, to address this issue. But within that, there are kind of like smaller working groups. So one that's across the whole Bay is called BayCan, and they do a lot of work on this as a whole region. One of our groups of stakeholders that we worked with on this project was the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority. So that was governments and agencies across like the San Mateo, Santa Clara County area, anywhere around San Francisco Creek. So there are different levels of collaboration on this. And as to your point about the bathtub, yeah, there are studies that show that, especially with hard armoring and like hard infrastructure, protecting one area can kind of like reflect that water to other parts of the bay. But that's one benefit of nature-based solutions, is that they don't, imagine if your bathtub had like sponges for the walls, like they reduce the energy so that the waves and water like bounce around less. So that bathtub effect is likely to be reduced if we can invest in nature-based solutions for flooding adaptation.
Okay, great. Looking at some more that we have. There are several questions about what an adaptation pathway looks like, and more specifically, what it is.
Yeah, I can begin to tackle that. Unfortunately, it's going to vary considerably depending on what location you're trying to adapt. But most generally, when you're speaking about an adaptation pathway, what it's aiming to do is to set up a path or a roadmap looking into how a site might adapt into the future, looking at near-term, mid-term, and long-term solutions, and what steps are needed along the way to get you there, and what are the decision points. So an example, if we just have not a real park unit or not a real beach in mind, but just, an example beach A in California, a part of the pathway might recommend, for example, to do some beach nourishment in the near term. The pathway would then also recommend what the next step might be and what that decision point, or I mentioned earlier, trigger points, would be to know when to implement that next step. And usually it's something that would indicate that that beach nourishment or whatever that near-term solution is no longer being effective. But to make that decision to move to that next step before it's ineffective. And so these are some new approaches that California is implementing or recommending in how we adapt to sea level rise. And State Parks is testing that out in our pilot project down in San Diego. And we've started to implement it in some other areas as well. There's some good examples of what these can look like. Usually, if you can picture a subway map of different tunnels going in different directions and linking to different locations, they can be really complicated because there's a vast suite of different adaptation options that you might implement a particular project. But hopefully with good engagement with the public and other key stakeholders, you can begin to narrow down what those options are and really lay out a path forward.
Sounds good. Let's see, what are some other ones we have? I saw one, I think, Michelle, this would also be for you. Is any of the adaptation implementation work for the state also coordinated with federal efforts? And what federal efforts are in progress that you know of?
I'm trying to see the question. Was it, sorry, specific to state parks or was it general to the state?
It just says the state, but if you could speak to,
Okay.
you could speak specifically to state parks, or if that's more,
yeah,
where you know.
Sure. So generally, we at state parks, it's great to also look at our federal partners as, especially like the National Park Service and others as a good example and collaborative partner. There's several of our state parks are adjacent to other, not state lands, but federal lands. They're also a common landowner in the state of California. And so where it does make sense, there are collaborative projects that are implemented. I am not aware of a specific one, or I can't think of a specific one at the moment, but I can think of certain regions where that might be taking place, such as Point Reyes area. We also, I'm still blanking on the naval base. I wish I could remember their name, but they have also expressed interest in our sea level rise work in San Diego, especially thinking about how our Silver Strand State Beach in that area is closely linked to that naval base. And so we'll likely be doing some collaborative efforts down there. Sorry, probably not the answer they were looking for, but don't have projects off the top of my head.
Oh, if there's any follow-up questions, people can always send them to us and we'll get back to them as much as possible. Let's see. Here's one. What is being done about cliff collapse due to sea level rise, king tides, and salt marsh ineffectuality? There have been an increase in activity and fatalities over the past few years. Not sure which one of you would like to address that one?
So cliff collapse is like a pretty different system than the marsh system that I was talking about. So we don't typically have cliffs in estuarine environments like San Francisco Bay. And I think there's been a lot of really kind of like publicized cliff collapses in Southern California recently. The USGS the U.S. Geological Survey is working on kind of like predictive models to anticipate when these will happen. Emily mentioned the NOAA sea level rise viewer. There is also a USGS sea level rise viewer that includes coastal change, such as cliff collapse. I can drop a link for that in the chat if anyone wants to check it out. But yeah, it's a problem, and it turns out that it's really difficult to predict when this is going to happen.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and add, I wanted to thank, I saw someone in chat said Naval Base Coronado. Thank you. That was the one I've been thinking of. I appreciate that. But with respect to this question, state parks in a separate program, I'm loosely connected to it, but not directly. State parks also does fund oceanographic research, and primarily through Scripps Institute Oceanography. And part of some of the projects that we are funding is looking at cliff collapse and trying to model future projections of that cliff retreat. And we also, in our work, we do primarily use the Cosmos viewer that Rae was mentioning, produced by the USGS, the Coastal Storm Modeling System. And it's viewer, the Our Coast, Our Future viewer. And like Rae was saying, it does have that cliff retreat modeling. So not only when doing vulnerability assessments looking at flooding, you can also incorporate these other coastal hazards into your assessments as well. So typically including things like flooding and wave run up, cliff retreat, and also groundwater intrusion, which are also major impacts that we experience.
Okay, great. I actually had, I can just jump in real fast. I had a quick question for you, Rae. When you were discussing how you could look at the economic, how much money you would save by implementing this type of adaptation, is the socioeconomic community in that location considered at all, or is it strictly more of like an economic cost issue?
We did, so the dollar values that I shared are based on like building inventory. So that is separate from, you know, social vulnerability and the socioeconomic side of things. The report that I dropped a link for with the Nature Conservancy has a little bit more information on how we looked at vulnerable communities. So BCDC, the kind of like Bay Area Coastal Commission, has published data that's census block by census block on social vulnerability of Bay Area communities. And so we looked at that in our analysis too, to try to figure out how this type of marsh restoration would impact particularly vulnerable communities. And the BCDC report shows how they kind of identified what vulnerable means, but it's things like English as a second language, doesn't own a car, elderly, low income, renters, things like that. So yeah, our report does touch on that. It turns out that like at our current sea level, a lot of the flood risk in San Mateo County is concentrated in disadvantaged communities. But as sea level rises, the damages become a little more widespread. So one trend that we see in our analysis is that at present sea level, marsh restoration benefits more disadvantaged community members, whereas as sea level increases, marsh restoration benefits proportionally less disadvantaged community members.
Okay, thanks for that. Here's one for Michelle. Why was San Diego Coast selected as the pilot region? And there's another one right below that that also refers to something you said. What is beach nourishment?
All right, I'll go with the first one first. So the San Diego Coast District, why was it selected? There's a variety of reasons. I'll try and summarize some of them quickly. First, looking at some of the key areas that are vulnerable across the state. Some reports have come out looking at San Diego beaches or Southern California beaches being especially vulnerable to sea level rise. With some statistics, I don't remember the exact statistic, but a really high number of them that by 2100 are projected to not be beaches anymore, be underwater. And so just knowing that it was a region of high concern for the state, that was one reason. Another reason would just be looking at internal capacity, right? And whether or not the district has the time and staffing to be able to work on a project of this magnitude. And San Diego already had several projects underway that were pointing or moving in a good direction with sea level rise adaptation. And so they were primed and ready to go. The staff were already trained on sea level rise and knew how to uptake this kind of work. And so that, and with a couple of other factors, was the reason why San Diego was picked as the pilot process. Though we are really hoping to be able to expand this to other regions of the state once we have finished that toolkit. And then beach nourishment. So a common adaptation project for beaches is to add additional sand to the beach. And so, the width of a beach changes throughout the year, right? They tend to grow in the summer, they tend to shrink in the winter as there's those winter storms. And over time, as sediment sources are depleted, thinking about, for example, how dams or other sources, levees, et cetera, limit sediment coming into the system, those beaches can unnaturally shrink more than they would have otherwise been. And so a type of solution to regrow the size of that beach would be to add more sand back onto it. And there's a couple of different methods for how you might do that, but generally that is what we mean by beach nourishment.
Okay, let's see. Here's another one. Michelle, this one's also for you. Are all state parks districts in progress of implementing adaptation plans? And can cooperating associations and nonprofit park operators be brought into the implementation planning for the parks where they support the department? It's a big question.
So one of the actions identified in our sea level rise strategy is to review the existing planning documents that we have for each of our park units, and where appropriate to update or to develop new ones to more effectively include sea level rise considerations. So that is a goal that we have outlined in our strategy to be able to undertake. We are starting the efforts in a variety of different manners. So the San Diego pilot process is one of those efforts where, you know, the resulting product, a vulnerability assessment adaptation plan, will be able to inform an actual planning document for the district. And so we're kind of that process is still happening. We'll be creating a process so we can continue to do it in the other areas. We don't want to stop adaptation though while we're waiting for that process to be finished. So there are other efforts in other districts to develop, for example, updated general plans or updated management plans that incorporate sea level rise. We're also doing a suite of vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning kind of studies and projects in other districts. I think the easiest answer is we're not doing it everywhere at once, right? But we are kind of tackling it bit by bit as we go across the coast. And certainly, so these efforts, it's really important to work with partners and to understand the public sentiment around how they want their beaches or their park units to look like in the future. And so certainly welcome collaboration and working together on these efforts.
Great, thanks. Let's see, I have another one for Rae. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about how this model, in terms of quantifying the economic value, is being applied. Exactly who's using it, where is it being used? Is it still more developmental? Are there future plans to expand? Stuff like that.
So the kind of assessment of benefits from marsh restoration, I would say, is a little more developmental, but people have been doing this for a while for coral reefs. So coral reefs kind of act like underwater breakwaters, and they can reduce wave activity. And there's a lot of studies showing that offshore coral reefs can play a really big role in protecting from flooding. So one example of how this has been kind of like incorporated into management is there is an example in the Mesoamerican Reef, so like near Cancun in Mexico, where there are a group of hotels on the beach, and they have an offshore coral reef that they realize has been kind of is protecting them from storms. And so the hotels also benefit from snorkeling on the reef. And so they decided to put an insurance policy on the coral reef. So they pay an insurance premium to insure the coral reef. And then if a hurricane comes through and damages it, the insurance payout pays for reef restoration. So this was put in place because they understood that they are getting real risk reduction benefits from the offshore reef, and they wanted to protect that asset into the future, much like how you would insure like a seawall or a jetty or things like that. So the same type of policy can be put in place for ecosystems, which is pretty cool.
I think we have time for one more quick one. So Michelle, this would be for you. Do any of the projects involve historic structures in the parks?
So I'm not sure if we're talking about specifically in San Diego or anywhere in the state park system. I would say certainly, right? We the state parks manages and protects a wide variety of assets and resources, whether it's just general facilities, natural resources, or cultural and historic resources. And we factor all of those various assets and resources into the work that we do. A good example would be, looking at Malibu Lagoon, and there's the historic structures right there on the coast that unfortunately have experienced some damage due to coastal hazards, wave run up and those short-term high water events. And so looking at solutions there, such as, softer approaches to not only protect the natural and the historic resources that are right there. And that's just one example there. We have a variety of these kinds of resources all along the coast. So certainly, and it's an important consideration.
Okay. Well, great. I think that's mainly what we have time for. Let's see if there's any other quick ones. I think that's about it. So again, thank you, both of you, for your wonderful presentations. I think we all learned a lot. And I think it's been mentioned in the chat, but the webinar recording will be sent out so people can review at their leisure or share if they want. And we'll also be sending out a survey, and we would appreciate any feedback you can give as we continue to host these events. We want to keep improving and keep getting better as we go on, so we can make sure that you're getting, the most that you can out of these Insider Speaker Series. Here are our social media handles if you want to continue to learn more about our work and what's going on. And again, just thank you for joining. Thank you for your support that helps make all of our work possible. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.